All right, moving on now into just about the halfway point of Cormac McCarthy's great novel, Blood Meridian. In this case, I'm only going to do three chapters, chapters 11, 12, and 13, because each of them is especially rich in content and discussion. I think the novel does get better and better as it goes along. Chapter 11 now begins with there are four Delaware Indians who are part of the Glanton Gang's party of 19 men, if I recall right. And one of them now is attacked by a grizzly bear as they're going along. It's a blonde grizzly bear who attacks one of the Delaware, grabs it with its jaws, and makes off with it into the woods like a rag doll, and they never see him again. So that there are only three Delaware Indians left with the group. And then so comes this interesting section in chapter 11 where they camp in the ruins of what McCarthy says here are Anasazi ruins. The only problem with that being that the Anasazi did not exist this far south. The Anasazi was a culture that's mostly a four corners culture of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, primarily in that zone. The Hopi are most likely their Fellahin descendants or ancestors. And below them we have the Mugian, who are a much more primitive group descending down into Mexico. And then in Arizona we have the Hohokam. So we have three of what Spengler might call cultural amoebae. These are not yet developed high civilizations. They are amoebae that shift around across space and time. They're not so rooted to the land as the high civilizations, which are rooted plant-like. So Spengler uses a different metaphor for the high civilizations than for these Neolithic type cultural amoebae. Although the Hohokam were extremely sophisticated and created a very complex irrigation system, which they most likely inherited from the Aztecs, coming north through the Sonoran Corridor and creating across the area of Arizona, Phoenix, and the Salt River this whole irrigation system. The reason why Phoenix was called by settlers there Phoenix was because when they got there, they found all these disused, dried up canals. A major drought hit the Southwest around 1300 AD and wiped out most of these societies. So the settlers found a bunch of empty canals and they decided, hey, let's reactivate these canals and use the water, drain it off the Salt River and the Gila River, and we'll plant orange trees and citrus trees, a perfect place, just like the Mediterranean to raise crops that do well in warm weather. So we'll call it Phoenix, a rebirth out of the ashes. But the Hohokam's days end with that drought, right at about 1300 AD. It was a centuries-long drought. The Anasazi survived a bit longer. They last from about 100 BC down to about 1600 AD. But the drought, of course, hit them hard as well. But they weren't this far south, but we'll grant that nonetheless, because the reason he has them is because of the analogy, the story that he wants to tell about those who build in stone versus the more transient Fellahin populations who come after them, who are either nomadic or not, but build in very ephemeral wood structures, mud structures, and so forth. And so the judge is sitting at the campfire as they're camped in these ruins, and he's drawing in his notebook representations of things that he has found, special types of leaves, part of a suit of Mexican armor, a foot guard, and he draws these things very carefully, just as on great expeditions, like say Napoleon's expedition into Egypt. There's a guy there who drew, the first great images that we have of the Egyptian pyramids. This is very standard practice in scientific expeditions, but this is not a scientific expedition. Nonetheless, the judge draws these things and then he throws everything into the fire, except for the notebook, tosses it into the fire, and a guy watching him, Webster, says, "What'd you do that for?" And he says, "I wish to expunge all this from the memory of men, because I have their representations. Now I've gotten rid of the things." One of the subtitles of the chapter is Representations and Things. In other words, signifiers and signifieds. Signifiers are what the judge has drawn here, but he's gotten rid of their anchors in the things to which they referred, the signifieds, so that they have disappeared, note. And just as the West has had this problem with deconstruction, in deconstructing the grand metaphysical transcendental signifieds, the great concepts and ideas that anchored our signifiers, our particular images of the cross, let's say, or the crucifixion, those transcendental signifieds are gone. They've been thrown into the fire of deconstruction. And so the guy insists, don't draw my picture. And the judge says, why not? What are you worried about? And he says, I don't want my picture drawn, just don't do it. So he doesn't, and the judge tells a story now, which is a kind of parable of the Anasazi, but of all civilizations. It's a theory of civilization that McCarthy has here, that he espouses through the mouth of the judge. And the judge says, so once upon a time, there was this harness maker guy who was living with a wife and 2 children. They all thought he was crazy, and he wasn't making a good living because his house was located outside of a town on a road. And so what he would do is dress himself up in Native American clothes and go down the way, and then beg for travelers coming, who would come by, beg them for money. And but then one day a traveler comes by who doesn't buy it. This is a white man in a Native American outlet. He's not going to give him any money. But the old man decides to invite him back into the house for a warm meal and some conversation, which they do. And once again, he asks him for money, and the traveler takes out 2 apparently rare coins. They're very unusual coins, passes them around the family, and the old man says, I wish I had one of those also to give to my wife. And he says, just give the coins back to me. So he does, he gives them back. And then he says, I'll walk you back to where you were before, and walks him back into the forest, but then kills him with a rock, bashes it in his head, leaves the body there, cuts himself up with a piece of flint, goes back to his wife and says, we were robbed, and the body, I buried the body, but we were robbed by robbers. And so the wife says, take me to the grave. So he takes her to the grave. She looks at it. She mourns over it. Apparently she liked the traveler. Goes and plants flowers there on a regular basis. Years go by, and then nobody finds out about the crime. The old man never harms anyone again. But on his deathbed, he tells his grown son, he makes a full confession, and the son forgives him. But then McCarthy says the son goes on to be a killer elsewhere. And so he disappears from the narrative. And the old woman keeps putting flowers on the grave. And as she ages and becomes senile, she thinks that the grave is that of her son, actually. And then so years pass, and then what happens is that there's a writer to this tale, the judge says, which is that the traveler had been on the way to visit a pregnant wife. He never made it there, obviously. And the wife gave birth to a son who was then disinherited and grew up with no father. So there was only an idol of perfection, a fantasy in his mind to which he could only aspire but could never get to. So the son was basically disinherited and had to grow up in the shadow of a mythical father. And so this is the tale that he tells, and he says then that men too, in plural, can be like the life of a single man. And then he points around at the ruins that they're in, and he says, these peoples that we're living in right now, camping in right now, were the Anasazi, and they built in stone, whereas the Indians around now just build in mud and wattle and dab. They build in very evanescent, vanishing structures, whereas those who build in stone seek to alter the architecture of the universe, and they create a perfection to which the fellaheen, or the fallen from a dying civilization, can only ever hope to approximate as an ideal but can never achieve. And this is true generally of civilizations. For example, the Mycenaeans, who built great stone structures, so great that the Greeks who came after them regarded them with awe as giants, and the Greeks themselves as diminished in stature. And the Greeks mostly built in wood for a very long time until they switched to stone. Or in the Renaissance. During the Renaissance, the Greeks themselves were regarded as the father, the missing father, that you could only hope to approximate at best, but never surpass in terms of works of art. And so civilizations do this. The judge's point is that it's a common paradigm, and it will keep happening. A civilization will arise and build in stone to perfection, and then it will die out, and others will just be fading, dying echoes of it. And so this is the reason, I think, why McCarthy situates the Anasazi so far south into Mexico, whereas as far as I know, they didn't exist there. Then the next day they keep riding, and they come across, they're looking for Apaches, remember, and they come across the ruins of an Apache village, and they find this mangy dog there that Glanton takes a liking to, and he manages to befriend it, so it becomes Glanton's dog, which follows his horse around. And then at the end of the chapter, they see the campfires on the distance of a group of Apaches called Heleños. So chapter 12 then deals with the massacre of these Heleños. Now these Heleños are a little bit different from the typical nomadic war band of the Apaches in that they're not just a war band because they're a large group containing women and children as well. So there are people on the move. They're nomadic, but they're not primarily a war band, though they are Apache. And so this now I want to introduce the concept of Deleuze-Guattari's idea of the war machine, which is something that they introduce from A Thousand Plateaus. And a war machine is something that is totally separate and independent of a state apparatus. And here, the Mexican government, under Governor Trias, is a state apparatus that has hired the Glanton Band as a war machine in servitude to protect itself against a nomadic war machine represented by the Apache. So war machines can take on a number of different types of social formations, but they're always horizontal, and they always try to eliminate the vertical structures of the striated spaces of state apparatus. They try to bring that down, whether we're talking about street gangs in LA, where the gang leader isn't going to be top dog for very long. They go through a rapid elimination of leadership. Gangs, packs, nomads are another example. The war machine is something quite separate from the state apparatus, as witnessed by the fact, as we've seen again and again, of a military coup. You don't have a military coup if the military isn't a separate independent entity from the state apparatus, to which it might be allied to defend itself against the nomadic war machine, whose goal is smooth space and to create, or even a heterogeneity of spaces that are deterritorialized from the state apparatus, where they take functions and reterritorialize them for the creation of spaces of heterogeneity, different spaces that are not under the overcoding of a vertical state apparatus which overcodes them. Even children at play, let's say, constitute in a benign version of this in miniature, who then take functions from the state apparatus, such as, say, a shopping cart, which is under the control of the state apparatus of the shopping mall, and use it for fun. They deterritorialize it from the state apparatus, and they use it in their gang for fun. So that's a miniature example of what this type of what a war machine is. Obviously, children don't constitute a war machine, but it's the same type of thing. They bands, packs, they're rhizomatic, and their job is to create smooth space in opposition to the state. War is not necessarily their objective, but it is very often the byproduct of their clashes with the state. So at this point, the Glanton Gang is a war machine that has been hired by the state apparatus of the Mexican government. Now, they are an internal proletariat within Mexico, or an external proletariat of whites that has come across the border, let's say, and now they're still an external proletariat, let's say, whereas later on McCarthy in his screenplay for The Counselor will deal with the opposite issue of the cartels crossing over the border as an external proletariat that becomes a very dangerous war machine within the United States. So whether it's internal or external depends on your point of view on which side of the boundary that we're talking about here. And so for now, the Captain White's war machine had been entirely an external proletariat of barbarians from the point of view of the Mexicans, barbarians who had just come in for spoils, as barbarians do. And with the German barbarians crossing the Limes and coming into Rome and taking it over, even when Theodoric or Odoacer proclaim themselves kings of Rome, they are still an external proletariat. They don't belong there. And so they are still dangerous. And that's the case with Captain White's gang that was massacred by the Comanches. And so here too now we have the issue of, so the Glanton Gang has been hired by Governor Trias to defend the state apparatus of Mexico against this nomadic war machine represented by the Apaches, and also presumably Comanches, though I don't think they ever find Comanches. And these Heleños are Apaches, so then they proceed to massacre them. They go out down onto this plain at dawn, and they're quite brutal. They take lots of scalps, men, women, and children, and they're very brutal about this. I think they take something like 170 scalps and 8 heads, and Glanton thinks one of the heads, he goes after one of the guys. Some of the guys flee, some of the warriors, and gets one of their heads, and he thinks it might be Gomez, for which a very higher price has been set by Triaz. And the judge says, no, I've seen Gomez. It's not Gomez. So then they head back to, with their spoils, to collect their money now, to Chihuahua City in chapter 13. And chapter 13 is now the turning point of the narrative, where the ontological status now of this war machine of the Glanton gang, which has been in service to the state apparatus of Mexico, now breaks apart and becomes a very dangerous external barbarian proletariat who becomes just as dangerous as the Apaches. They become basically a nomadic war machine. Once they come back, they're welcomed as heroes. They're given money. Shop owners give them lots of credit and sell them things. But then pretty soon they overstay their welcome and they start becoming very barbaric. They start raping the women, engaging in drunken debauchery. Pretty soon no one wants to come outside of their houses. Merchants close their shops, and they have devolved, they've become now morally depraved and have become a very dangerous group. Just the same thing as an Apache war band, as we have seen the Apache war bands massacre entire villages. They don't massacre anyone at this point, but that changes very quickly as the narrative progresses, and then they leave Chihuahua City, and as they go out, they come across another city, another town, Catterzal, which is a decaying town, who does not welcome them, and they are escorted out by the military. Then they come to another town called Nakori, where they go into a cantina, and in this cantina, they go in and they sit down. There happens to be a funeral cortege coming down the road, and a couple of guys inside the cantina has insulted them. And so they're about to start a fight when they hear sound of what sounds like gunshots in the street, but it's actually this funeral cortege launching off firecrackers and rockets or whatever. So they go to the doorway, and meanwhile, one of the guys who has insulted them approaches one of the guys. I forget his name. Starts with a G. I forget what his name was. Doesn't matter. Anyway, he approaches the guy and stabs him in the back with a knife. The judge sees it. And then now all hell breaks loose, and a shootout takes place, and the Glanton gang simply murders all 28 people in the cantina and scalps them. Even though they're all Mexicans now, they're scalping now anyone and everyone, regardless of whether they are Apaches or Comanches or what have you. Now they have become a dangerous external proletariat, basically a barbarian war machine that has detached itself from the state apparatus. And is now incredibly dangerous. And so they massacre, scalp everyone in the cantina, then they leave the town and go on their way. And then they're pursued by soldiers at one point, and then they encounter a group of 9 Mexican soldiers, which they hunt down and then kill them. And I think they scalp them, I forget, scalp them. So they're on the loose now, and they are randomly massacring anyone and everyone who crosses them or insults them, or gives them the least reason for provocation. And so they have descended to the level of beasts. They are a becoming animal type of war machine, as symbolized by Glanton appropriating the dog. That's a becoming animal element. They are going down the strata, from the human strata to the animal stratum, which is where they're operating at right now. And they are on the loose and very dangerous. And so, now note too that in this book, the kid isn't much of a hero. The novel starts, McCarthy deconstructs a number of Western stereotypes and archetypes, one of which is that he starts off with the kid, and you think the kid is going to be the hero of the novel, whose point of view we're going to follow, but the kid kind of disappears, especially when he joins the Glanton gang. He doesn't say much. McCarthy doesn't even refer to him much, because he is dissolved into the collective assemblage of the group. And so McCarthy tracks the group as the protagonist, not the hero, but the protagonist. And we don't, as in typical Westerns now, have a bunch of white guys embodying good old-fashioned Western prairie values, such as fidelity, vengeance against those who have crossed you. Every time you get that in a Western, there's always a moral equation of the white Western cowboy as somehow morally superior to the Mexicans, who are viewed as marauders, or to the Native Americans, who are viewed as vermin. We don't have that here because our white representatives are as depraved as any band of marauders is ever portrayed in a Western, which is one of the reasons why this probably will never actually be made into a movie, because there's no one to identify with. There's no hero for the audience to root for, because everyone is almost on an equal level of depravity. And so this is a complete postmodern deconstruction of all the typical iconotypes, stereotypes, and archetypes of the Western. And so in a certain way, as a postmodern novel, it defeats filming. I don't think we're ever going to see it as a film, because it's a novel of complete moral depravity on all sides. It's not a novel of heroes versus villains. It's simply a novel of villains versus villains. And audience goers are not going to, they're just not going to want to sit through that. So we'll stop there for those 3 chapters.